Welcome to Cornerstone's Pastors Podcast. I'm Pastor Scott here with Pastors Brian and Matt.
Hello.
Hey.
And you are into week 3, 4, 5,
I don't know.
something of the coronavirus quarantine. And not only, if you're anything like us, you not only are having trouble remembering what day it is, but probably also what week it is.
I thought yesterday was Friday.
I saw someone is selling an analog
It's
clock
Wednesday right now.
that just has the days on it. So you can look at the clock and just know what day it is.
Which was
was surprisingly helpful.
I literally said, "Oh, the weekend yesterday," and Nicole's like, "It's Tuesday." I was like, "I don't think I could be further off." That's far
pretty much,
away.
It's
about
pretty
as
much
hard
as
as-
wrong as
Yeah.
you can get. Yeah, which I'm sure Nicole thoroughly enjoyed.
I mean, weekend Matt is way better than midweek Matt. Trust me.
So this week, we're in the midst of all of this. We are all spending probably more time than we were 2, 3, 4 weeks ago on screens, right? We're getting our news from screens. We're getting our updates from screens. We're connecting. And I think maybe more specifically, we're connecting with one another on screens. There's maybe Zoom meetings for work. There's Zoom meetings to connect with one other. I actually played Trivial Pursuit via Zoom with my brothers and their wives a couple of nights ago.
Who won?
I did. Thank you for
Yeah, you
asking.
did, yeah.
I did. But by
Congratulations.
I mean, well, so here's the other thing. I actually had the benefit of having two like preteens in my house. Well, two essentially teenagers in my house who knew like half the answers.
Wait,
that
can't
I
you
didn't.
just cheat on like looking things up?
You could,
Oh, you could,
but I didn't.
Oh, you didn't.
No, we won fair and square.
How do we know?
I can call Jeff or John. And
Yeah, they could. I mean, Amir was sitting. Not a mirror was behind me, but Amir Sarani, who lives with Sorori, I mispronounced his last name, who lives with us, was sitting right behind me, and he was actually on my brother's team, so he was making sure we weren't cheating. But anyways, we played Trivial Pursuit, and all this to say.
But you don't even have the physical little.
So my
wedge
brother
pieces.
had the pieces in the game board and like a camera on the game board.
I know, but like
And
putting
then
them on there. Is
He
so
would hold up the
satisfying.
card to the screen so that we could read it off for each other.
Oh.
I mean,
So today we're going to
Oh.
teach you how to play different board games virtually.
tonight we're gonna try to play Ticket to Ride virtually.
If you
know
thought
what that
board
is.
games
We're
were terrible
boring.
in person, just wait until
Wait
you
until
do
they're
them over a
logistically
Zoom
difficult.
meeting.
Well, so this is part of the point, right? Like Zoom is making Google Hangouts, Zoom, whatever you're using, like it's kind of what we're using now to connect with one another, and it's not great. Like it's not the same, right? Like it's very different. But all that to say, we're all spending a lot more time on screens. I think it's probably pretty rare to find at this point someone who's spending less time on a screen than they were a month ago.
Maybe
There might be,
medical professionals or someone like that.
yeah, but
And we love you,
and we do.
and we're praying for you.
Actually, we did this morning and are
Yes.
continuing to. But I think even for a lot of medical professionals, I think for everybody, like everybody's spending a lot of more time on screens than they did before. And so I guess what I want to talk about is just some of the subtle dangers of that and some of the things we need to be aware of and thinking through so that we can actually evaluate how we engage with screens. And because I think throwing all caution to the wind and being like, well, this is just life now, puts us in a really precarious and dangerous space. So what do you guys see as some of the dangers of spending more time on screens that we just need to be aware of as we navigate this new season in life where we in some ways just necessarily are spending more time on screens?
So there, on the one hand, there's a lot of reasons to be spending time on screens, right? I mean, I think that's pretty clear. This is the only way you're going to be able to communicate with people and have some level of social interaction. One of the dangers is that screens in general are used predominantly for entertainment, and they kind of have been in our history. And so to spend more time on screens is to sort of lean into just being more passively entertained. Whether those screens are social media refreshes or they're Netflix or TV or something like that, the more you kind of get rid of all rules and routines around around screen time, even as an adult. Sometimes screen time is thought of for like kids, but as adults, we have our version of screen time rules too, whether they're explicit or not. And so when you get rid of all of that and it's just gone, all of a sudden you find yourself just leaning into sitting around, doing nothing, being entertained. And that comes with problems. Like there's a danger to that, because when you just kind of passively get entertained, one of the big things that happens is you find yourself kind of clicking off from the world around you. And so there's a temptation to that now, because there's ways that you feel like you can't participate in the world around you the way you could before. But sort of just leaning into that so much that you just kind of give up on really trying to do anything. It can create kind of a false reality around you in certain ways.
Yeah, I think that's really good. I think that's part of why I want to get at this, because I think that there's a temptation that we can just dive into this new season and be like, well, this is just the way life has to be now, and not think about it carefully, not consider it carefully, not even strive to set up some of those expectations and guidelines, because that are actually probably all the more needed now.
Yeah, I mean, some of the fact that there's a pandemic doesn't change the fact that, like, in normal life, quote unquote normal life, we struggle with the idea of rest and what rest is in general. And screens are oftentimes how we think about resting or resting time, and they're just not restful in the way that the Bible talks about rest and what rest is supposed to be. And they can be a part of that, but there's a kind of distractedness, and I like the way that you described it, Brian, the kind of false reality that it can create for you, and the disconnection from the world around you. We already feel disconnected. We already are more disconnected now because we're not seeing people in person. We're not doing normal routines. It can disconnect you even more from the reality around you in a way that's really unhealthy and unhelpful, especially in this season.
Well, that's where screens are kind of like candy. Like, I think, and that's true in a lot of ways. Like, when you're hungry and you grab, gummy bears or something, it doesn't work like long term, and it doesn't give you the nutrition you need, and it only propagates the hunger in a lot of ways. And screens are that way, especially for socially. So, like, there are ways that especially if you're someone who's not surrounded by roommates or family right now, like turning on a show can feel like you've got people in the room. It sounds really weird, but I think it's true.
Yeah.
And there's ways that
there's noise.
Yeah, and let's say you're kind of anxious, or you're a little depressed, or you're just kind of reeling or overwhelmed from all that's going on, or from stuff that's entirely separate from the pandemic. There's a way that we feel like rest and relaxation and some sort of salve for all those emotions and feelings and responses can come from I just want to sit down and watch something. Mm-hmm. And there's a way that can be, I think Matt's right, that can be a piece of rest. But there's a truth that I think we've all experienced, where when you're really, really overwhelmed, you're stressed out, you're tired or whatever, and you turn on a show and autoplay, makes it go for an hour and a half or longer, you know the feeling where when that's done, you don't feel better. Like, you don't feel more rested. And so if you can imagine, like, multiplying that throughout multiple days and weeks and months is not going to leave you at the end of this more rested, more aware of what's going on, more in touch with God and yourself and other people. It's going to leave you just kind of like you ate a bunch of candy and never got any nutrition.
Well, and you might be also eating candy while doing that too. It's like a double whammy. You might be eating gummy bears instead of eating healthy also. And so it's it gets you on both sides.
It's just fascinating the way that we feel, the thing that we look to quickly as a fix ends up only making the problem worse. And that's something that's just worth being aware of, because you want to be careful not to dive into that too deeply and find yourself in a bigger hole than you started.
Okay, so I think people struggle with this, right? Like, I think it's one thing to be like, and they may even hear this and it makes sense in one sense, right? It sounds like, I mean, to continue the analogy, it sounds like you should eat your vegetables, your fruits and vegetables, right? Like, I mean, everybody's like, yeah, I know, but like what's the alternative, right? Like, in a time like this, when people are feeling that hunger, I mean, I think that there's maybe we do have to, I guess I'd say this, we do have to, in some ways, especially if it has to do with your job, you may have to be on a screen more than you were a month ago, just regardless. But I'm not sure that means that you have to engage in passive entertainment more than you normally would, especially and if that's something you've done just to in one sense like cope and get through the last few weeks, like I totally get that. But if we're looking towards like a longer term season here, right, that's going over the course of months, I think what I hear you saying is that you might have to be on a screen more, but you don't necessarily have to engage in passive entertainment more than normal. And if not, what's the alternative? Like where should we point people instead of being, okay, I'll turn it off and now I'm just sitting here, what does that look like in an isolated age?
Well, I think so if your life or your sort of allotted time to various things, so to work and exercise and social, and kind of and screens in normal life is like a pie chart. So you kind of have these different things allotted. I think one of the things you're trying to do is not have the entertainment screen part just take up all the remainder that's left over now that we're quarantined. So like if a bunch of stuff got taken out of out of the pie chart, you want other parts to expand too. So you want to, again, that's for people who have maybe that time, but you want to be able to say, okay, like I want to read a book. I want to go outside and just be outside for a little bit. I want to maybe exercise more and get creative with that. I want to use some of my screen time that's expanding not to just be more entertainment. So I didn't go from 20% entertainment to 80% entertainment. Yeah. I want to use that to play board games with people I know, to have social interaction, to approximate social interaction. And so I would just say the goal is to not let entertainment be the thing that replaces everything that has extra room in your life now. It shouldn't fill up all the extra room you have.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think that's helpful, and I think that's something that we're going to have to navigate, right, person by person, situation by situation, day to day, week to week. But I think that's actually like a really helpful way to begin to think about and even evaluate how we're engaging with entertainment. The goal isn't necessarily like to go back to normal in this sense, in this like old normalcy, but to evaluate like is this passivity or this passive entertainment taking up, like, is it the thing that I use to fill whenever any other time opens up, right? And
practically, like I think that looks like so first you probably are gonna increase the percentage of entertainment that you're taking in just given the situation we're in. Yeah. So just for people to like not freak out, like it's probably going to get bigger, and that's okay. That's not like the end of the world. The idea is it shouldn't be the only thing that gets bigger and take up everything else. But then too, like I think it's worth mentioning just very practically, you're going to need to put in about 3 to 5% more effort to get something that will give you real rest on the front end than you would to turn on the TV. But I think if you can think about it that way, like opening a book feels like more effort. It just does than sitting down and turning something on and letting it autoplay for you. And I get that, and I feel it too. But the idea of kind of having it in your brain, very practical, like I think that 3 or 5% is a worthwhile investment to have something different than just sitting in front of entertainment or scrolling through stuff or whatever over and over and over again. It's going to leave me feeling more rested, like I'm going to get more back. And knowing that for me personally, helps me get in. It helps me get over the hump and say, no, this is actually going to feed my soul a little more, like in a way that's going to feel restful.
Yeah. And I mean, what I hear you saying is that we need to fight for that which is actually restful.
Yeah.
Right. And that does require a little bit of effort, which sounds weird because we're like, no, this isn't supposed to be effort. I'm resting, right? I'm supposed to be resting. Like, but it
resting as the ceasing of all activity.
Yeah.
And ceasing of your mind rather than an active kind of rest.
Yeah. And I think the kind of rest God calls us to is an active rest that engages him, right? That engages truth, that finds our rest and our hope and our peace in him. And I think you're right. I think we know that any substitute other than him leaves us still thirsty, right? Leaves us still hungry. Doesn't leave us rested when we repeatedly, at least, turn to those things for rest.
And I think that, Brian, you're right. We know that feeling of binge watching something and not feeling better.
Yeah.
And yet there's still like this lie on the front end of it that says maybe this will help this time.
And sure, and there's a balance there. Like some rest is passive rest. Some rest is taking a nap or watching a show. That's okay. But if that's all it is, it's going to end up draining you dry internally and like in your soul and your emotions and your heart. And it's just, you don't want that right now.
Yeah.
And so to know that it's just a little bit of effort to get over the hump, to get something that really does refresh you internally is a really great thing to keep in your back pocket and pull it out when you know you need it.
And I think this is why actually there's a lot of people who've been doing more things with their hands too, which is kind of interesting, like a lot more baking or cooking or things like that.
My wife made bread.
Yeah,
My
bread.
wife
That's
and
a
my
huge
daughter
thing right now, right?
made
Like sourdough
bread,
or,
like,
or
for
whatever.
the first time in
forever.
our marriage.
For the first, I was referencing
For the
Frozen.
For
But
the first time in forever.
The
Think I've got a chance.
Come for the wisdom and insight. Stay for the singing.
we have now gone into the unknown.
Stay for the show tunes.
Boo, boo. How are there boos in the background when there's no one else here? This is crazy. I'm still getting booed for my jokes. It's you guys booing at home. That's what's
what it
going
is.
on.
Yeah.
But I mean, like, I think there's something to be said about doing more things with your hand. I mean, doing things with your hands, doing things, building stuff or whatever.
Yeah.
Or I don't know what you do. What your
Cardboard. I build stuff with cardboard.
Yeah,
That's what I do.
give it
That's
24 hours and then build
like
stuff with cardboard
expertise
or
I get.
whatever. yeah. I mean, something like there's something about that, and there's something I think helpful about that and restful about that in a weird way.
Okay. So I wanted to talk about screen time, and I think passive entertainment's a part of that, right? And I think that's really an important one, and I'm glad we've talked about that. But I also want to talk about this weird disembodied communication we're engaging in by being on screens for all of our social interaction.
I hate it.
For all of our meetings, right?
I hate it so much.
I feel the same way. I mean, I think in a lot of ways it's exposing the fact that technology can't ever actually replace the interpersonal engagement of embodied soul, of one embodied soul with another embodied soul in space time together, right? Like there's no way to, you can approximate it, but you can't replace it. And I think that's becoming clearer and clearer for all of us. But at the same time, I think because of the nature of the world in which we're in right now, because of the situation we're in, I think love looks like communicating that way. Love looks like engaging in an approximation, not in the real thing. Love doesn't look like, I forget it, we're just gonna all get together physically anyways. Love looks like engaging this way.
That's unloving.
That would be unloving. But so in the midst of that, as we should be engaging kind of in this disembodied communication, what are some of the dangers or potential consequences of that maybe we should just strive to be aware of, that maybe we're not on the forefront of it seeing as we engage in that?
I mean, it's harder to, I think, pay attention to somebody virtually and like really listen to them. I think it's easier to be distracted. It's easier to be looking at your phone or looking at something else or doing something else at the same time, like quote unquote multitasking, which is not really a thing that we can really do. It's we don't multitask, we just do other things poorly. So if you're multitasking while on a Zoom call or something like that, which I'm guilty of, you're just not listening well is all that is happening. I think that is a hard thing, because then it's already a medium that doesn't lend itself towards intimacy, and then there's sort of this like half listening going on multiple sides that makes it even harder. I think.
I think so. What's interesting is now that everyone's doing this, so you have kind of this conversation happening out in the world and online about, and it revolves around how difficult this can be, like productivity wise. It's interesting. It's all logistics. It's like, oh, this is hard because we're not in the same room, and it's easier to do that, and it's hard because people aren't muting themselves or whatever. Like there's all these funny things that are happening, which makes it sound like the real problem here is that it's getting in the way of our ability to be efficient. But I haven't heard a lot of people in terms of like direct experience, like theoretically, sure. I haven't heard almost anybody talk about how it's not the same and it's bad interpersonally. I've heard them talk about how it's not good efficiency-wise. And I think that there's something missing from that conversation. And that's true for a lot of how this works. These are going to be things that we don't notice right away because it's easier to see when someone's unmuted and how that's getting in the way of the meeting than it is how this is affecting us kind of as human beings. It's a less direct effect, but it's a real thing because I think this kind of communication, the reason why it's easier to multitask is because we just don't have a category for how to do this and not turn people into objects. So really what ends up happening is like we're having this meeting. It just the medium itself, like part of it's the meeting is we have to do this meeting because we have to get certain things done. And so business wise, that's how it looks for a lot of people who are still working. But just the way we've used screens historically, the way they function is they're windows into something that we want to get or we want to see. And that makes it kind of an isolating experience. And it makes it where what you're seeing and getting is built around kind of your needs, your productivity, your efficiency. And so it's going to teach us really subtly that all these interactions are about us and they're about us individually and not us together. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, to Matt's point, like it's just harder to listen well because we have to be very intentional to build that in. Like I'm talking with another human being who is an embodied person like I am in somewhere else, and they deserve my attention because of that. They're not a video on a screen that happens to be able to talk back to me.
Yeah, and this, I mean, so this leads into, I think, a couple of the temptations and I think the struggles I see. One is, I think, related to this multitasking temptation. I think it's increasingly tempting to be multitasking when on a screen because we can do all these different things. We do all these different things through this like tiny little, window in front of us, and so. I mean, I find myself, I think it lends it doesn't demand attention the same way a person sitting in front of you does, right? Like there's not it's not rude to your computer to flip windows, right? But it's rude to someone who you're sitting in front of to like pick up your phone and look at it. There's or to start talking to someone else when they're talking, right? But it's not rude to our computer to do that. And so we jump back and forth. And so, I mean, I find myself not only multitasking more when I'm on calls with people, but I find myself trying to multitask more when I'm off, which then floods into that because I'm just my flesh in that sense is not it fights against focused thought, focused attention, I think, in every sense, especially interpersonally. And to your point, Brian, I think that result, that lack of intentional thought and paying attention, what it ultimately does is objectifies, right? It turns people into objects that we're utilizing, that we need information from, and then once we get that information, we're like have you ever gotten to a point in a call where you're like, okay, that's all the information I need, but you're still talking, so I'm going to start working on something else or thinking about something else.
Every time you call me, I feel that way.
People are doing that with this podcast right
people
now.
People are doing it right now. Now, multitasking with a podcast is a little bit different than someone calling you. If you're cooking right now,
you're good.
You're good.
No, that's okay. That's okay. The kind of the kind of multitasking I do, that's okay. Just not the kind you do.
You want to do this right here, right now? In front of everybody?
But I want to get to this objectification thing because I actually think that this more time on screens and the more we interact with one another through this in this mediated way, I actually think that it makes things like pornography more tempting. I think people are in this time, they're like, I'm on my screen already. I'm engaging with people already. What's a kind of engagement with a version of a person on or a person on a screen that makes me feel good, that again gets to this like passive entertainment? I think it's a really small leap from passive entertainment on Netflix to passive entertainment in pornography. And I think people don't appreciate how small of a step that is, and then fall into it and then end up wondering, how did I end up here? Right? Like, how did I end up here when I didn't intend to. And I think that in a lot of ways, this mediated season is going to make a lot of the hidden sins that people struggle with and battle with, both more tempting and even a harder fight. I mean, do you guys think there's something to that, or?
Absolutely. I think there's absolutely something to that. I think that for several reasons. I mean, one, just being cooped up or kind of isolated is already a recipe for temptation, and stronger temptation than normal in any of these areas. I think that when you're overwhelmed or your routines are upset, that's also a recipe for temptation. And I think that when you're finding yourself looking to solve some of those issues of isolation and lack of routine and maybe anxiety and maybe being overwhelmed with a screen, it is a very small step to go from I need to look for a thrill or look for some rest through this version of entertainment to jump over to another much more sinful version of entertainment.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that for a lot of people, like, and maybe they're like, oh, you know what? I'm not like going searching, like paying in some like hardcore porn site. Like, but I think there's lots of things that could fall into that category of pornography that we're seeking out for some form of visual or even emotional sexualized gratification, that we're going to be that people are more kind of tempted into taking steps towards or falling in.
I think there's reasons for that, right? Like there's and it's a range of things. I think what you're describing is not just pornography in like a traditional sense, but like there's other kinds of, I don't know, titillating things or edgier things that maybe we feel like are okay in this time. I think for a lot of people, for a lot of men and women, there are, in the midst of crises, certain temptations that are like quote unquote comfort temptations that they run to. And I definitely think pornography or sexual lust in general is one of those things that is a very common thing for people to run to as like an earthly form of quote unquote comfort. Not that it actually provides comfort, but and for a lot of people, for a lot of men and women, those paths have been walked so steadily over the years where something hard or difficult happens at work, something stressful happens in life, and those are paths that have been run on a lot as a source of earthly comfort or whatever. And I think that's why it's very dangerous in this time. Absolutely.
Okay, so how, I mean, maybe in addition to the ways that we talked about, like just fighting the temptation towards screen time generally, how can people be fighting for purity and fighting against that pull into the titillating, into whether it's pornography in that sense explicitly, or just a show that they know in their heart, like the reason they're engaging with it is because of that impact it has on their eyes, right? Because of what they're looking for. Like, how do people fight against that in a time like this, when they are increasingly isolated, when they have to be on screens more?
When it comes to especially like the fight against pornography or sexual lust, but I think in a lot of ways, I'm always encouraged and challenged by, there's a Thomas Chalmers sermon, The Expulsive Power of a New Affection, and a lot of the argument that he makes in this, it's an old guy, I don't know, it's from the 1800s or something, I think. And you can look it up. It's actually a really great sermon. But his point is the only way to get rid of like powerful affections that like pull on your heart, whether it's power and greed or pleasure or food or sex or whatever it is, these things that pull on your heart, is they can't just be fought against themselves. They actually have to be replaced with a higher and a stronger affection. And I think in this season, this is a really hard thing, but I think it's a similar fight that is true in all of life, but especially in this season, our fight for a closeness to God and a deep intimacy with God in this season is also a fight against sin. And the only way, for me, and I think for all of us, the way that you fight against the temptations in your life, no matter what they are, whether it's entertainment or food, or like I said, or sex, or whatever it is to find your satisfaction in Christ and feed your soul with truth of God and His Word, to crowd out those things. I mean, I think that is a really powerful and necessary approach in this season, and it's hard, like we talked about last week with our relationship with God and being out of rhythms and all those things. We have to fight for the fight against those kinds of sins is a fight for a closeness and a deepness in our relationship with God.
Which is one of those things that is going to feel like it requires effort on the front, but is going to give you rest long term. It's helpful to remember that it's not just, well, should I give in and get some comfort, or should I, work harder and go after God? No. The idea is that it's going to take a little bit of effort on the beginning to focus on God, and then that affection is going to have an explosive power, and it's going to do things.
And that affection it's not, I think that's really helpful. It's not like, oh, you need to work really hard. It's like you need to find your rest in God's active love towards you, right?
Which is a real thing that exists and that you can find actual rest in.
And He loves you, and that grace is real, and that then you can bank on that, right? And so, but you have to, Brian always has the illustration. It was an illustration originally about sanctification, about how do you, what role do we have in sanctification? What role does God have in sanctification? And Brian described it as, a hose, right? And God pouring out righteousness in the water of this hose. Mm-hmm. And being sanctified is standing in front of the hose, putting yourself in a position to experience God's grace and love. It's sort of like, and the other illustration I think you used is the command to go to sleep. Yeah. It's like you can't put yourself to sleep. What you do is you put yourself in a position to experience sleep. And in the same way, what we're talking about is putting yourself in a position to experience the grace and love of God, so that affection can well up in you to fight against these other kinds of temptations.
Yeah, and when you have insomnia, you don't go stay awake then. When it's hard, you actually find ways to put yourself in a better position to go to sleep.
Yeah. I mean, and I think the reason we're talking about this, right, is to, excuse me, maybe confirm to people that these temptations are going to be, if you're experiencing these temptations in a more heightened way, or any temptation in a more heightened way during this season, that's normal, right? Like that ought to be expected when the heat gets turned up and when life gets harder and we're out of our routines. Like these things are we should expect these things to well up in our hearts. We should expect these things these temptations to come flying at us. And in the face of them, though, the answer is still the same, right? The ultimate hope we have in Christ, the turning to Him, crying out to Him, seeking Him, being captivated again with Him, fighting for time in the Word, fighting for inputs that encourage our hearts towards catching a glimpse of Him instead of catching a glimpse of the things of this world. Again, he is sufficient and gives us, by His Spirit, sufficient power to address and walk forward in these things in freedom, even in a time like this. But we have to remember that. We have to be reminded of that. We have to remember that these temptations are real, that we can expect them, and that God meets us in the midst of that temptation, giving us, and maybe even just with this podcast, like planting a little seed, giving us a way of escape.
We have to fight. That. We have to fight, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a temptation underneath it that says, oh, this is a weird season. I'm just going to indulge myself in weird ways.
Yeah.
And I think that is extremely dangerous for a lot of reasons. One, it's just bad for your soul in general. But the other thing is you might be creating because of the length of this time, you might be creating new habits that are going to be really hard to break once we're out of this.
Yeah.
Well,
and that's really scary.
Yeah, the way that it's not that you're just going to indulge yourself. It's that you feel like you're being put out in so many other areas.
Yeah.
Like I'm working so hard in other ways. My routine is so like you feel like you're already wearing having to work harder. So here's just one. We're all going to have one area where, or maybe several, where it's like, well, so that I can just give in on this. And I think it's helpful to recognize that part of the fight, we tend to think that the problem is when the line you cross is sort of what you look at or whether you've indulged in a particular way. And that's not true. Like the line you cross is the direction you're moving. And that's like incredibly helpful. Like you'll find yourself watching things, going to places, or again, it doesn't have to be pornography is what we're talking about in a sense now, but any kind of temptation, things like self-pity. Like there's ways that food, like there's a million ways that this can look, and you can find yourself, you're either going to be looking for joy or looking for a thrill. And if you're looking for joy, you're going to find yourself feeling much more prone to say, in this small way, I want to trend towards what's going to give me rest and joy that I know is real and true. Or if you're just looking for a thrill, in very small ways, you're going to find yourself inching away from that. And then you find yourself surprised when you cross some big line you had that you had drawn in the sand, when you've been crossing little lines internally, looking for little thrills, little pieces of comfort and satisfaction along the way. That's where the fight is. And when you're isolated, that for long periods of time, that's what happens. Is it's these tiny little decisions of, you know what, I can watch that. It's not that big of a deal. You know, I can entertain this thought. It's not that big of a deal.
I deserve this.
Yeah. And it's not like I'm doing anything wrong. And maybe that's not even a conscious thought yet, but deep in your heart and your soul, you know what you're trending towards and what you're trending away from in these little moments of trying to grab something for yourself. And that's where the battle is. If you're looking at that and saying, I really want to trend towards something that's going to give me real rest and joy, even though it might seem a little harder on the front end, you're going to find yourself in a much better position to not create horrible habits and to not find yourself having sinned pretty greatly across the board in this and having drained yourself in the process so that you just end up like a kind of an empty husk by the end. And gosh, that sounds horrible, but we all know that's what's on the other end of the siren call of this stuff.
Yeah. And if you're in the midst of that right now, I mean, I just want to say, if you're in the midst of that battle and maybe you feel like over the last few weeks you've been losing that battle, I just want to remind you again, like God's grace is sufficient for all of that, right? If you have been kind of falling in some horrific ways, if things have been piling on and you feel like you're actually self-harming in that way, right? You're not helping yourself out. Things are worse off than when you started. God's grace, God meets you in that moment with his grace, with his forgiveness, speaks his grace. He speaks words not of condemnation, but of invitation into genuine repentance and power so that you can live the life he's called you to live, even in the midst of this, for his ultimate glory and for your greatest joy, because that's what he desires the most, is to glorify himself in you finding your rest, your comfort, your peace in him. And so there's more we can talk about. There's more I want to talk about. I think in the coming weeks, we're going to try to talk about some of the other things that pop up in the midst of this and how the gospel speaks into them, whether it's anxiety, depression, things like that, other things that are in essence normal to this experience, but that God meets us in and shows us the way forward in. But before we go, actually, just the last thing I want to mention on this topic of screens and things like that, I would encourage you to be aware of the fact that your kids are on screens more now than they ever have been before as well.
Their school districts might be
encouraging. And that's not to shame you for anything that you've been doing or any choices you've made, but just to be aware that all of these same temptations are going to be in front of them as well. And so we should be engaged with them in that, helping them helping them fight for the right kind of, and for the kind of engagement that honors God. And also, I think just like this is a time of greater temptation towards secret sins in our lives, I think it's going to be a time of greater temptations towards secret sins in our kids' lives as well. And so everything we can do to fight for openness, for accountability, for having deep conversations with them, for not allowing them to seclude themselves and do things beknownst to us, I think is a grace towards them as well. That could be its own podcast, but I also know that the dynamics of navigating these waters and screens and parenting in this season are really, really complex. So more than anything, I just want to plant the seed that it not only can you strive to love God yourself in this, but as you engage with roommates and particularly with kids, you can love them well by thinking through these things increasingly as they have to engage in them too.
We had a conference last year or 2 years ago on technology and parenting, and you had a document, Scotty, about Covenant Eyes and other things like that. Maybe there's a way we can find a way to post that again or something like that.
Yeah, it's on the website. Maybe we'll try to post it along with the on a blog or something like that.
Yeah.
I think something like that would probably be really helpful now. So
it's also worth mentioning just that screens are going to be the way that temptation can come at us uniquely in this season. They can also be a way that we handle it in this season. And I think it's worth saying you should be using a screen to talk to somebody else and confess your sins, or a phone call.
Yeah.
But that needs to be something if it's coming at you that way, then you can use it also as a way to fight it. And one of the best ways to do that is to get in front of another human being and not just wait until you've crossed some weird line you have in your head. Oh, here's where I've really done something wrong. Yeah. I can imagine people listening to this right now and just being like, okay, well, I'm not really there yet. Yeah, that's still a good reason to talk about your temptations with somebody else. And I would really, really strongly encourage you in a time of isolation with your community group, with someone you trust, whatever. Don't just confess sins after the fact. Talk about temptation before the fact. Yeah. Be really open and honest with people and be really open and honest with God. All these podcasts kind of come together in that particular way. And leverage the screens that are the source of temptation to be the source of you striving for holiness and for actual rest and joy too.
Yeah. Well, that's a great place to end, and super I think of key importance. Reach out to those around you. Confession, even if it's just of the temptation of is a huge part of how God wants to deal with this in our lives. Reach out to your community group leaders, to a friend in your community group. If you don't know who else to reach out to reach out to us. Yeah. We'd be happy to talk with you, walk with you through this as well. So know that we love you, and we will see you virtually on Sunday.